in board roles or executive positions, highly encourage you to seek out the MIOD and see if the membership with us would be beneficial for you. So today we have a program where we will be discussing a report on the specific effects of COVID-19 on gender in the workplace. And we've got a report by the International Finance Corporation, which we are going to discuss first. And then later on, I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming Ms. Poon Han, who's the Chief People Officer of City Holdings, and Mr. Brett Jones, who is the CEO of Wave Money, to discuss further on practical examples from their own workplaces on this particular role of gender in COVID-19, and also in general, what these fantastic organizations are doing to address gender issues in the workplace and where we can go from here on. So first, I'd like to invite Mr. Anna Aliyev from the IFC to kick us off with the agenda for today, and then say a few words of introduction. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Thierry. Good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, I'm the first person to talk today. Let me just start by sharing my screen in just a second. All right, can you see that?
It says, yeah, we have it now. It's not in presentation mode yet. And now it is.
All right, great. I'll start. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. To everyone again, my name is Anna Aliyev, and I'm with IFC's corporate governance program in Myanmar. And we've been working on corporate governance in Myanmar for the last few years with support of our donors, UK and Australian governments. Yeah, again, the topic of today is gender equality, really, and we'll start really with a session on boards because it's we think really what the ensuring the adequate tone at the top, right? Having adequate diversity basically at the board and senior executive level is quite important. And we'll have a brief session today, right? And there'll be some opportunities to ask questions that, I mean, maybe just to discuss during the panel and afterwards. But again, the goal is to look on a few things, right? And I'll be talking also about IFC's board diversity study, which we did last year, and which also looks at this issue, tries to analyze the practices and tries to come up with solutions in East Asia. And also we'll try maybe to think how some of these solutions and recommendations and actually findings are applicable in Myanmar. We have 5 items to cover during the next 25 minutes, which is quite ambitious, but we'll try to do it to the extent possible. We'll talk about the current level of board gender diversity. We'll look at the drivers of, for diversity at the board. We'll look at the impact which good practices can have on company performance. We'll talk about the challenges and opportunities for advancing, again, board gender diversity. Firstly, about board gender diversity, right? What's the current situation? And because our programs, right, IFC's advisory programs, we work throughout the Asia, also work on a global level. We have governance ESG advisory programs around the world, and wanted to concentrate this time specifically on Asia and try to see what's happening when it comes to diversity of boards, right? And what companies are doing to improve, and whether actually, does this make a difference, right? What happens when companies have better, more diverse boards? But before starting, we looked at some other available data, including this report from Deloitte, which is an updated version, right? And it seemed when you look at the global levels, right, Asia was a bit behind, right? Some of the countries involved, some of the regions involved, right? Having this in mind, really, we kind of decided to develop our own board diversity study, which would look into the issues, which look into countries more specifically. We didn't, we look at which countries we wanted to focus on, and we wanted to see really, and what are the levels of current practices and how this benefits the companies. We decided to focus initially on 6 countries in ASEAN. Sorry, can somebody mute, please? 6 countries in ASEAN, which is Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And we looked also at China, right, which is another, a big country, although it's not, part of ASEAN. We looked at the listed companies in these countries, and we analyzed the data of from almost 1,900 companies from these countries. We looked at their actual compositions of a board. We also looked at our senior leadership positions, right, which including CEO, COO, CFO, and a few other key positions in the board. What's happening on the diversity side there. And we looked at the financial metrics, two financial metrics, meaning return on equity and return on assets. From a point whether the companies, which are really applying better diversity practices, how are they doing on their financial parameters? We did a study, right? And we share the overall results which came out as on the basis of that. We saw what we average rate basically in ASEAN, right? For a board, for at least one board member, it was 61% in companies. There were a lot of companies which didn't have any board members, about 39%, and about 16% in all ASEAN countries plus China had more than 30% of a board composed by women of more, the ratio was more than 30%. Again, some countries did better than others. Surprisingly, Indonesia had about 31% of boards, which had more than 30% of women. Some other countries like Singapore and Singapore and Philippines were a bit behind. And we'll look at all this in a bit more detail. But it was kind of interesting dynamic here. We also look at the average number of board members, right, at all these companies. And it looked at ASEAN average was about 14.9%, right? That's basically the number of board seats which women have, across all these countries. 7.1%. Again, another interesting statistics which we wanted to focus on is the number of basically board chair positions which women have. And we also, as I said, look at the senior management positions too, just to see how our companies are doing there. Again, why did we decide to look at the senior management positions, not only focusing on the board? It's also just to get the dynamics, right? Because often you see, kind of a criticism, or basically like companies want to, kind of say, the reason why we're not having a lot of women on their boards is because there's not adequate, there's not enough talent, right? And we want to really look at the senior management professionals, right, too, right, just to see whether actually sometimes argument has any really merit behind it. And again, we looked at all the countries when it comes to their individual ratings. It seemed was Thailand, right? It had the most, had more women on average than our countries. It was at like 20.4%. It was followed up by Vietnam and Indonesia with 15 and 14.9%. Interestingly enough, right? It seemed what we were actually qualified. And a lot of senior positions occupied by women. Again, one interesting statistic came to me from Philippines too, where you had a quite low number of board members, right? Women board members, but you had a lot of women in senior management positions, over 32%. Which again, showcases the reasons which we'll be talking about, right? The reasons what really stops companies from hiring more diverse boards. It's not because there is a lack of talent, right? It's really because of all the other issues. One of the aspects, right, which we looked at, right? So we looked at the average number of women, right, on boards. We looked at the chairs, we looked at the managers, and we'll try to do a bit more analysis, right, of who these female board members are, where they come from, right? And we looked at company size, the industry, and I'll talk about it later. But one thing I wanted to draw attention to, because I think it's quite unique in Asia. If you look at our countries, Europe, for example, or other regions, you often see what actually a lot of women are non-executive, what we call non-executive board members, right? And people, I mean, basically women who are not affiliated with companies or families. In Asia, because of the ownership structure, right, you have a lot of family-owned firms, and the ratio in Asia is a bit higher if you look at maybe our regions of the world, except maybe Middle East and Latin America. You could see there was a correlation between number of women on boards and basically companies which were basically had like an individual as the largest shareholder. Well, individual as a largest shareholder basically means whether the company is family owned, right? And I think that was basically an evidence, right? What in Asia, many of these women are working in the companies which are owned by their own respective families. Just some status, some data from Myanmar, right? Again, Myanmar wasn't covered by the study. It looked at countries, 6 countries in ASEAN plus China. And again, the reason why Myanmar wasn't counted because we're looking at the listed firms primarily, because we wanted to get financial and our non-financial data, right? Just to come up with a good statistical analysis. And size of market in Myanmar plus maybe availability of certain information at the time wasn't adequate to perform such an analysis. However, there are our studies in Myanmar which provide some, I mean, relevant context for that. You may be aware, right, what IFC, and we did produce a report which is called Corporate Governance Scorecard Report in 2019, right, which is based on 2018 data. And the average number of women directors in companies was about 16%. Which is, I mean, which is a bit higher than the ASEAN average, but I'll get back to that. There are also other reports, right? The report which was produced by my colleagues Ellen and Oliver, which is actually quite an interesting report about gender and microfinance in Myanmar, and which had some, I mean, interesting data there too. I mean, despite the number of female employees, the number of senior managers, and yeah, it was below basically that ratio, and women were really not presented adequately on the boards of the companies in that sector too. Quite just an interesting data which came out only yesterday. I looked at QuintSR report, right, which stated what only 13 companies have the policy on diversity, equal opportunities, and also only 9% disclosed, disclosed their data on the diversity, basically, which I think helps to get a bit more accurate information about number of companies which have diverse boards, which are actually trying to introduce better practices, because number of 16% is again higher than average, better than some of the countries in the region are doing. But the reason is that, again, the companies which we looked at during our assessment in 2019, a lot of them were family-owned firms, right? And because just of the nature of business, because the families often look for a talent within basically their family networks, that really explains a bit slightly higher number in companies surveyed compared to ASEAN average here. And again, that is confirmed by our data, which we have from this December, according to Data Yever, which is working together with MCRB on QuintSR report. And again, which covers the same firms which were covered under QuintSR. Only 57%, sorry, less than about 20% of companies disclose their board size and membership. A lot of these companies don't have any women on their boards, and that's really quite easy to see if you just go to companies listed on Myanmar on Yangon Stock Exchange, and you can see actually some of the boards of companies where don't have any women. It's all male-dominated boards. And you have on average, companies had 21% of women board members, right? But that's out of companies which are disclosing their board membership. If you look at total, I think it will be less than 10% in general. So that generally gives you also a bit of an idea about what's happening in Myanmar. We'll talk a bit about drivers, right, of gender diversity, and what helps companies to improve, right? And there are 2 sets of parameters here which we'll talk about. We'll talk about top-down drivers and bottom-up drivers. Again, top-down drivers. Focus on. During the last decade was on really quotas, right? You see many countries around the world often are introducing quotas, and usually now I think Australia has a quota. Countries in Europe have quota, which is about 30%, right? Companies, especially listed firms, are required to have 30% of board seats given to female directors. Our source of inspiration are often also corporate governance codes, right? Corporate governance codes, which may not be a mandatory documents, they can be comply or explain policies. They actually often have requirements like that. They require companies to adopt and disclose their diversity policies, basically incentivizing companies to have more women through better disclosure, right? Nobody wants to disclose what we are doing, not something entirely ethical, right? Or not in line with what our companies may be doing. So that's a reputational matter. And also gives companies some flexibility too, right? Because one thing about quotas is because some companies may actually think it's not good, like in a long term, right? It's I think good it's an interesting short-term solution, but when it comes to long-term change of practices, I think the effects are still being studied. And there are also bottom-up drivers, right? Female labor participation. If there are more females in certain industry, that can affect the diversity of board members. Policies on gender equality, really, which exists, and that really refers to policies which help women really to be adequately represented, right, and have adequate career, right? Maternity policies, leave policies, and ours, and really public pressure on companies, which can come from, various industries. There are also other factors, right, which we looked at and which really do affect the board diversity during our studies, which show what industries, really does have a factor. Some industries like IT or manufacturing, you had clearly less women on the boards versus some of the industries where you had more women on boards, such as services, for example. Ownership structure actually has, clear effect. And in fact, family-owned firms tend, in Asia at least, they tend to have more women on boards. The effect of institutional investors actually is quite important, although less evident. It's less evident in Asia compared to our countries. Institutional investors in Asia, at least, for now, right, we really weren't pushing too much for board diversity. And that was one of the areas where actually companies and even regulators thought what things should change. Again, one effect which can drive really the change at the board level is also, diverse client base. If you have more female board members, right? More female clients having it really saw that you had more female board members on boards of companies. I guess because companies understood what women maybe, it's good to have a diversity on the board, giving the company's business model and client base. And here's some data. You can probably look at it afterwards. And we kind of covered that in very brief detail. I want to focus a bit more on a parameter of impact, right? Because we talk about good practices, and it's often, these are ethical practices which companies should comply with. But we also try to make a business case for that, right? So, companies, comply with better practices, not just because it's, ethically right? And good thing to do, but also very strong business rationale for that. And we were able to see that. We looked at, again, two parameters, return on assets and return on equity, which are short-term really measures, but it really helps get quite a good idea about whether good practices really can boost company performance. And we saw a clear link, right? And we saw, firstly, if a company has at least one woman on board, right, you can see the average return and rate on return on assets and return on equity was something higher. And if company had more than 30% of their board members, right, or 30 or above, right, that was also quite significant. And it's actually, it was same for ASEAN and same for China. So it's really gives a a very good reason, right, to apply this in companies. So you do it not because it's good, but also, I mean, can benefit your company in a longer term. We really knew that, right? We kind of worked with companies, and we saw that evidence. But we did a study, and actually we analyzed that data from like almost 1,900 companies just to get some hard science, right? Scientific, I mean, statistically verified, and I mean, significant data to support that conclusion. But again, why actually companies are doing better when it comes to financial performance versus ours? And again, we looked at the parameters, and I mean, again, we thought access to wider pool of talent was one of the reasons. Again, having more diverse perspectives in decision making, right? I mean, it's really good. I mean, you talk about all this diversity in the board, right? To avoid what we call groupthink, right? So board members, you have various backgrounds, different skills, right? That's what people often focus on. You talk about independence on the board. You want to have independent board members, right? Board members who are not affiliated with, I mean, shareholders or company executives. But also with diversity is the actual gender diversity. And when you have that on board, that really helps to companies to make better decision, and it helps to improve overall board governance. And again, there are other reasons, right, which help to improve that better financial performance. It helps to manage better overall environmental and social and governance, basically environment within companies. ESG is very important, and companies who have more diverse boards are doing better on that front, in that field. We have more transparent working environment, really helps to build that structure, helps to improve that culture within the companies. A more risk-averse approach, that's what also one of the findings which we did uncover during our study, and also more flexible leadership when you have diversity both at the board and at the management level. And really that does help to improve companies' financial performance, which is relevant always, but especially nowadays. There are, again, challenges, right? And you probably know about these challenges, of course, right? And some of them are really how we classify them, country level challenges, which really don't depend too much on the company itself, but also on the existing frameworks. Household pressures, right? Again, women sometimes have to take a leave. I mean, there can be additional pressures because of family and our considerations, and that really makes it harder for women to apply for senior executives and executive and board position in companies. There can be stereotypes, right, which really create obstacles for promoting and actually for advancing in their careers. And there was a question about talent pipeline, but really we looked at that argument, and we thought actually it wasn't, relevant that much any longer, right? We looked at the quality of board members and executive members in terms of education, in terms of experience, and we really found that very unjustified. Talent really is there at this period of time. We looked then at other matters, right, which really are creating obstacles for companies. To have diverse women cadre really at the boards and at the management levels. What we call old boys network, right? That refers to how the directors are being appointed. Well, there should be a formal process for appointment of board members, but unfortunately, in many countries, there's something which we called old boys network. Basically, when board members are appointed through, because of some personal links, relationships, or because they are members of some kind of club, right? And that's sometimes women just don't have access to those networks yet, right? Again, visibility of female leaders, we looked at that, and visibility, again, we looked at from two, it can really was, looked at it from several parameters. It, again, had to do with industry, where, and there was a bit of that there too. So certain industries, we were less visible female leaders. Sometimes it had to do with ownership structure. You had basically families, family-owned firms, and female basically leaders, basically, right, good board members weren't that willing, right, or weren't that visible in that context, because everybody thought basically board seats are just for family members. But we'll talk about some solutions too, right? About how all of that can be overcome. All of these issues can be overcome. Again, we thought about solutions about corporate governance codes, right? And maybe role of stock exchanges in improving the situation. Having codes with which are what we call comply or explain codes, basically, which are maybe not mandatory, but which incentivize good behavior, right? Through better disclosure, better recognition, can be a good way to go. We just did also a comparison. Philippines, which has a comply or explain approach, right, and which adopted its own code, and Malaysia, which had a quota approach. And we basically did about the same when it comes to the board representation, right? So having corporate governance code, at least a start, right, with adequate diversity provisions would be a good and positive policy. Family-friendly policies, again, for women who want to take a break during their careers or who may need our support, right? Was in the thing which needed to be adopted at the country level. Again, we looked at the countries, many of them have this policy in place, but there were again opportunities for improvement. Directories and data, right? And that's something which hopefully can be done also in Myanmar. Again, creating data about possible good female candidates. That role often is played by the country institute of director, and hopefully MID can do that as well. That means basically creating director, basically registry or directory of qualified candidates, and these candidates then can eventually be accessed by the companies themselves. There are opportunities at the company level, right? There should be strong commitment, should be adequate culture instituted at the companies, and again, it should be promoted throughout the company. It can be done through mentorship programs. It can be done through adapting relevant policies, right? Just if you can just go, mentally a few slides back, right, when I mentioned the policies on gender and diversity and equal opportunity, which was released in the Puntisa report, right, which just gives you an idea what there is still, a room for improvement in Myanmar. Pipelines, again, and networks for women. I'll again, draw attention to MID and maybe some other groups which exist in the region and globally. Basically, the institutes and these networks can help women to advance, right? There is 30% club, which works in Asia in 2 countries. Institutes of directors can play a big role, and basically in helping to build that pipeline, right? And get help with visibility of good female professionals. And our advocacy groups, right, which can help to advance and basically help women to rise to senior position and get access, right, to our board opportunities. Again, and here just a way forward. What we found, there was one thing which we kind of found out during this study, basically diversity build diversity. It's really hard to make first steps, but when you make these steps, right, it becomes quite easier to constantly improve, right? A lot of things basically happen almost automatically. When you have certain critical mass of women directors or women at the management level, right? The environment will be improving and the attitudes will be changing. Regardless, even if situation improves, right, at a certain company or in a certain country, we always should be an effort to create an encouraging environment. And that one of the ways how you do it is through raising awareness about benefits of gender diversity, why it's essential for all countries in East Asia, including Myanmar. Again, we try to do it through this study, this survey. Also, we did a number of other activities in Myanmar, jointly with our colleagues from gender and through MID and regulators in Myanmar. We did what we called raising, basically, did an activity basically on raising the case for gender equality, especially with stock exchanges for a number of years, which was part of a global initiatives. We did a lot of these activities, over the last 3 years. This year we couldn't do it because of COVID, but hopefully we'll be able to relaunch the initiative later on. Again, one more initiative I wanted to draw your attention to, right, in the context of that visibility and having basically a pipeline, right, and having the role model for women, right? I see published Myanmar Trailblazers report, right, which showcased basically profiles of female leaders around the world, right, and how they succeeded in various environments. And we also had a very good candidate, though, from Myanmar, from City Mart Holdings, who shared her story, who was featured in the report, and who shared some very useful advice for women candidates, right? Any women who want to make career as a board member. In general. Also pleased to say she's also sitting on the board of Myanmar Institute of Directors. She's Myanmar, she's MID board member. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. I think I went a bit over time by 5 minutes, but I hope you found it very useful. The report is available online. Please take your time and read it. And eventually, I hope we can maybe do some similar study in Myanmar on these topics, right? Looking at the board composition of Myanmar companies in terms of diversity, actually go a bit more, maybe a bit more, and look at the board, diversity at the level of committees and at the level of management, and also do also similar analysis, right? How companies in Myanmar who have more diverse city policies, right, in place are doing versus other companies which are not doing so well. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna. It's incredibly useful and interesting. I must admit I am at a loss as to whom I'm inviting next, either Oliver or Alan. So if you can raise your hand and say who you are, who's speaking next, I would very much appreciate it. Sorry about that.
That's me next.
All right. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Oliver. So I have the pleasure of inviting Oliver Roundtree to take us through another part of the report next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deri, and thanks, Anna, for that great presentation. Can I just check that you can see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see it
perfect.
fine. Thank you.
Perfect. So my name is Oliver Roundtree. I'm Associate Operations Officer with IFC, working on gender in Myanmar. And I will be presenting the start of this section, looking at broader recommendations for businesses around gender during COVID-19. I'll then be joined by my colleague, Ellen Mains, who covers gender in Myanmar as well as in the Pacific, who will cover the second half of this section. So, of course, as we know, COVID is having a huge impact on businesses and in Myanmar as well as across the wider world. So what we wanted to do in this section, following on from Anar's terrific presentation on the importance of gender diversity on boards, what we really wanted to do is call to the attention of directors and senior leaders in Myanmar how COVID is having a gender specific and gender differentiated impact in Myanmar as well as in other countries, and how that impact can often be disproportionate for women, and pose some possible questions and possible approaches that businesses in Myanmar can take to ensure both that their women staff and customers are weathering the storm of COVID and coping as well as possible under the circumstances, but also make sure that they are doing everything they can to maximize their own productivity and positioning within the market during the pandemic when it comes to female staff and female customers. So I'll start just by talking about a little of the gender differentiated and overall impact of COVID from a business perspective. And of course, this won't come as a surprise to all of you that research has shown that the pandemic has had a considerable effect on businesses in Myanmar. So from a survey done by the Business Coalition for Gender Equality in Myanmar back in between May and July, found that a survey of 24 Myanmar companies reported that 2/3 had seen a decline in customer demand, which they had found to be one of the main challenges in the early months of the pandemic. So of course, bearing in mind here that this data is even from before the second lockdown, which will have amplified these effects. 4 out of 5 were allowing employees to telecommute or to work from home and had provided the required technology. Crucially, 2 out of 5 of those businesses were partially or fully non-operational due to the pandemic. And then most importantly for today's topic, 1/3 of those companies had recognized that social norms meant that women and men were being impacted differently by the pandemic. And that theme is what we're really going to be touching on throughout this section of the presentation. So taking a step back to look at how the economic impact in Myanmar is impacting men and women differently. So I have some data here from a recent World Bank study that has been conducted during the pandemic and has looked at how the impact has differed on male and female headed households. And what it found was that 90% of male household heads had worked in the last 3 months during the pandemic versus only 76% of female headed households. Now, of course, that does reflect trends from before the pandemic. This is not entirely unique to the pandemic. Women's economic participation rates were already lower, but the pandemic has definitely exacerbated existing inequalities. And part of that is because of women's greater representation in industries that have been more affected by the pandemic. So things like tourism, hospitality, and textile manufacturing, all of which have faced significant shutdowns due to COVID. There are a number of other effects that are disproportionate for women. And I should highlight here that this data won't necessarily be reflective of your staff, but it is important to be aware that there are these highly disproportionate gendered impacts from COVID amongst the wider population in Myanmar that it's really critical to be aware of in whatever action you're taking. This will be affecting your staff sometimes, but also your suppliers and your customers. So for example, the same World Bank study had found that women were much more likely to be concerned about household finances in the next month. 53% of women household heads were concerned versus 38% of male. And likewise, 48% of female household heads were concerned about having enough to eat next week versus 28% of male household heads. On the right, corresponding to that, again from Business Coalition for Gender Equality, we saw that their study found that 71% of women had had their hours reduced during the pandemic, compared to 57% of men. So all of this really is just to highlight some of the context before we move into recommendations, that this pandemic is affecting everybody, but it's really important to be aware that some of these economic impacts in particular are affecting women differently. And so any changes that are made to workforce, whether that be laying people off or different conditions of employment, it's really critical to bear these differences in mind. So given that context, we really wanted to present some targeted recommendations today. So we drew from a study conducted across several countries by IFC, COVID-19 and gender equality, 6 actions for the private sector. So we've boiled that down to the 5 recommendations that we thought were the most relevant for the Myanmar context. And we'll run through those and present some supporting data from Myanmar and from other countries. So just to give a quick overview, the 5 recommendations we'll talk through. So firstly is around, where possible, retaining staff and maintaining a strong gender balance. Secondly, considering the digital gender divide in digitalization efforts, which of course have been accelerated during the pandemic. Thirdly, providing support to employees who are often facing increased care demands, which are disproportionately impacting on women. Fourth, ensuring respectful workplaces during the pandemic, both virtually and in person. And then 5, a critical one, supporting employees' mental health and well-being. So firstly, talking about staff retention. Of course, many companies have been in a difficult financial position and have had to consider or implement staff layoffs due to the pandemic. So really, we want to talk through some alternative steps that might be possible to consider before taking this step, but also how job losses can disproportionately impact on women. So we do encourage that where possible, businesses should consider alternatives to layoffs if at all possible. So for businesses to be able to be resilient during and recover better from the crisis, it's particularly important that they can retain their skilled and experienced staff and also keep their staff motivated during the pandemic. Businesses that can retain their employees are more likely to be able to resume economic activities effectively after the pandemic and capitalize on new opportunities and recover more quickly. It's also important to highlight, especially given the context that I've already laid out a little earlier, important to think about how layoffs and retrenchment of employees could affect women's staff disproportionately, given at times additional economic pressures on them, family responsibilities, or the fact that different employment in different departments that may have different levels of layoffs might affect women's staff disproportionately and might impact on the gender balance within an organization. So we would encourage that companies consider a few different alternatives to dismissals and retrenchment before taking that step. A few examples include reskilling and redeployment of workers, whether into different departments or different roles, reducing or adjusting hours to be able to reduce the total number of hours worked while still retaining the same number of staff. Where relevant or possible, reducing pay again to cut costs without having to cut headcount. Providing income safeguards can strengthen that security for staff, such as paid leave, particularly essential during the pandemic, or a severance package. And then finally, furloughing personnel, or granting them a leave of absence. So temporarily laying off workers, but with a full intention of bringing them back when possible. So these are a few steps that are worth considering, but we also wanted to share a few questions that businesses can reflect on around a response to the pandemic. What steps can they take and what questions should they be asking when they're considering them? And these are drawn from IFC's research on this topic and global best practice for a safe and resilient workforce. So firstly, when thinking about business restructuring, consider, can output or services be changed to meet the emergency COVID-19 needs? Is there a way that the company can pivot or adapt to meet needs that have emerged during the pandemic? And linked to that, how can workforce skills transition to meet those new demands, new scale or type of operations? So can employees be redeployed to address those new needs? Secondly is thinking about state-specific COVID-19 measures. So looking into what specific government measures are being put in place around COVID-19, such as income protection schemes or limitations on COVID-19 related dismissals, which it's really essential that any business be aware of if they are having to consider this. Thirdly is considering vulnerable workers within your workforce. So are there parts of the workforce that are particularly prone to income shocks, such as migrant workers or contracted workforces, or relevant to this topic, workers with caregiving roles? So bearing in mind what that, again, disproportionate impact could be from layoffs and really being cautious about and taking any such action. Next, thinking about third parties. Are alternative payment measures for suppliers or contractors possible, such as forward ordering interim payments or payments on order or receipt? And then finally, thinking about laws and standards. What are the relevant OHS or labor standards, such as sick pay and the right to refuse unsafe work? all of these really critical considerations in a pandemic environment. Similarly, what are the relevant social security provisions and considerations? So unemployment, sickness benefits, and workers' comp. All of these are really crucial things for businesses to have in mind during the pandemic. And I think will speak to a lot of the disproportionate needs of women staff that I've alluded to throughout this presentation. So really crucial questions to bear in mind. Now, finally, on this section, I wanted to share with you a quick case study of an organization called Wormald Fiji, a partner of IFC, and how they've managed to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on employees and do so in a gender sensitive way. So Wormald is a security company in Fiji, so provides security personnel to businesses. And while much of their business is essential workers and had not been impacted by the pandemic, their aviation security personnel had been, and they make up 380 of Wormald's staff. So there had been a risk to a portion of the workforce. So the leadership adopted a step-by-step process to prevent dismissals and layoff. So they went through a consultative process, conducting information and consultation sessions to understand the needs of those different groups. They then designed evidence-based interventions based on that consultation process to help the company cater to the needs of those different staff groups, rather than just taking a one-size-fits-all approach that didn't necessarily meet the specific needs of those groups. So what was the outcome of that quite considered consultation process? So employees were given the option of either to have redeployment in other parts of the business. Similarly, a disaster relief fund was established, which helped support employees who had to take leave during the pandemic, for example, to take on care duties. Counseling was provided to staff who were experiencing mental health challenges, and there was extended unpaid leave and housing provided to staff who had to relocate as a result of the changes in their deployment and employment that had resulted from that consultation process. Finally, women staff in particular were offered greater flexibility with their work schedule. So they were offered a compressed work week, shift swaps, and work programs without a risk of retrenchment. So as well as minimizing the impact overall of the pandemic, these steps also managed to address the specific challenges and needs that women staff were facing within the organization. Now, moving on to the second area we wanted to cover. So considering the digital gender divide in digitalization efforts. So of course, COVID-19, one of the big impacts from a business perspective is how it has accelerated adoption and use of digital technologies within the work environment. It's really amplified society's dependence on technology to address our business and personal needs in our daily lives. Education has largely moved online, and as well as in many countries, retail and wholesalers who've switched to accommodate online ordering and delivery. Financial institutions have also accelerated their efforts to expand access to digital financial services wherever possible to their customers. And a survey conducted in Myanmar found that half of Myanmar companies said that the pandemic had created an opportunity for them to shift to remote working arrangements and new e-commerce and digital markets. So many companies in Myanmar are really seeing the opportunity that digital is presenting during the pandemic context. But with that in mind, it's really crucial just to highlight the point that in Myanmar, although the uptake of technology, in particular smartphones, has been remarkable, there is a gender divide in access, which is really important to bear in mind when providing services via mobile phones or other digital means. So while 78% of men in Myanmar own a mobile phone, according to research from the GSMA, only 68% of women do. Likewise, while 69% of men in Myanmar own a smartphone, that's 55% for women. So far from universal. In fact, only a little over half of women in the country own a smartphone. And then for internet use on a mobile phone, which is the primary means of accessing the internet in Myanmar, 58% of men do that on a regular basis versus 41% of women. So really important to bear in mind, particularly when reaching out to customers via digital channels, that when we're thinking about women customers, actually less than half will be regularly using mobile internet. So it is important to bear in mind traditional means of outreach to women customers, but also think about a few other potential steps, which I'll lay out now. So when deploying digital solutions, it's really crucial to consider the needs of those customers, but also of women staff. So another stat from GSMA research is that a lack of literacy in digital skills is a crucial barrier to use of mobile internet in Myanmar. So for 33% of women who are aware of mobile internet but don't use it, literacy in digital skills was the single top barrier preventing them from using it, from accessing the internet. So there's a digital skills gap that's very important to bear in mind. So when supporting remote work during the pandemic, it's very important to ensure that staff, particularly women staff, have the necessary equipment. But it's also critical to ensure that they have the necessary digital skills and provide training if needed to make sure that they can work effectively remotely. Similar considerations for women customers. So think about that lower rate of internet access that we've already talked about. And in particular, make sure that services are user-friendly and where you can provide support to your customers, and in particular women customers, with the onboarding process, and make sure that they know how to access your service and make use of it. And with that, I will hand over to Ellen for the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ollie. So I'm going to cover 3 key areas. One of them is around care for employees, children and elderly family members. One of them is around respectful workplaces, and one of them is around mental health. We can go to the next slide, please, Ollie. So we found during COVID-19 that it's had a massive impact on the working life of parents. We're finding that many parents are having to juggle childcare and work responsibilities, as well as elder care responsibilities. We're also finding that working mothers are particularly impacted by the crisis. Employers like yourselves have a really good opportunity to support families and enhance sustainability and productivity and profitability by thinking through how you can support your employees around care responsibilities. Next slide, please. We've already done some research in Myanmar. You might remember last year we launched a report called Tackling Childcare. I'm not going to go through all of the findings here, but what we found was that childcare was already an issue for many parents before the pandemic. And like some of the issues that Ollie's just been through, it has only worsened with the pandemic onset. Already there was 9 in 10 employees with children that said that childcare responsibilities were impacting their work. And more than half of parents with young children reported being absent from work at least one day during the past month because of their childcare responsibilities. We also know that there are not so many childcare options in Myanmar, and that many parents rely on family members to look after their children. One really critical thing that came out of this report, though, was that flexible working was the #1 benefit that employees said that would help them better manage their childcare responsibilities. And if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is a graph showing the most requested childcare support that working parents in Myanmar are looking for. And you can see there that flexible working is certainly the most requested benefit, followed by some other subsidies and fees and so forth. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that's really interesting is obviously that the onset of COVID, not just in Myanmar, but all around the globe, has really impacted parents because children are being forced to either stay home or in some cases study from home. And this is creating a huge amount of pressure for working parents. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that IFC launched a guide for employers around tackling childcare in the COVID era. And there are a few key questions that employers can consider when thinking through how they can support their employees. The first one is around what are the current directives and guidance from the government that impact employees' responsibilities as parents or carers? And obviously lockdown is a really clear one of these. The second is, what workplace policies do you currently have in place in your workplace? And is it enough to support your employees and their families? In order to find out a little bit more and think about how you can support employees under these circumstances, one thing you can do is conduct a survey of your employees. Ask them what sort of support they need, and then you can ensure that you can introduce policies and benefits which are going to meet their needs. The fourth thing is to have a look and see whether there are any international or local online resources available to help parents during the crisis. So certainly check out this guide. It's very, very helpful. On to the next slide. One of the things that when we talk about flexible work, people often think flexible working means only working from home, but actually flexible working means a whole range of different things. And you can see on the screen here various different types of flexible working that companies can consider introducing as benefits for their staff. I wanted to point to one of these in particular, and that is shift swaps, because often if your workers are in a customer-facing role, they work in a bank, or perhaps like they may work in CityMart as at the checkout, they can't work from home. It's not possible. But one way in which the employer can support their needs and help them manage their care responsibilities is to enable them to shift swap, to change their shifts around with other co-workers. And this is a really good way in which companies can create flexible options. There are some further considerations though to think about, and I'm just going to go through some of those on the next slide. When you're thinking about what flexible work arrangements to offer in your workplace, you need to think about the types of business operation on the types of jobs you have in your organization. Not every type of flexible working option will suit your organization. Something that's really important too is that your flexible work policy and procedures should be formalized and clearly communicated. It's very important that employees are aware of the policy and that they know how to apply for flexible work. Flexible working should also be available to all your employees, not just women and men with children. It's very important from a fairness perspective that you make sure that this is something that's widely offered. Flexible working should not mean that employees are working all hours of the day either, so it's very important to have some boundaries around that. And in cases where employees are reluctant to try flexible working, one suggestion is that managers should role model good flexible working practice themselves so employees can see how it works. The last slide I wanted to show you around care was just some considerations to keep in mind when you've got employees working from home. These might seem really obvious, but sometimes it's easy to forget some of them. The first is, does your employee have internet connectivity? Do they have the right equipment and tools of trade they need to do their job? Does your employee need support to enable remote learning for their children? We had one client who was photocopying school material for the children of their employees so that they were able to do activities from home. Another thing to consider is support on parenting skills and mental health. Some companies are offering this kind of thing to support parents who are trying to juggle both working from home and looking after children. Does your employee have the information they need that's up to date on health and hygiene practices so they're safe working from home? What additional financial support is needed to support your employees at this time? And the last one is, does your employee have access to emergency care? What is the process? How can you support them if they become ill, for example? All right, let's move on to the next area. And this is around ensuring respectful workplace cultures, both virtually and in person. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that during COVID, gender-based violence, including disrespect in the workplace, is increasing. It's increasing during COVID, but it also increases during other public health emergencies and other crises. Increased risks include workplace bullying, workplace sexual harassment, customer and client aggression, sexual exploitation and abuse connected to the workplace, and domestic violence. There's a guide also linked at the bottom of the page here, which you'll see, which has got some more details on this, but I'm just going to run you through some of the key points. On to the next slide. Okay, you might recall that 2 years ago in 2018, IFC did a study together with the Dinar facility on respectful workplaces in Myanmar. And at the time, we found that bullying and sexual harassment was present in Myanmar workplaces. Since then, we've actually done a comparison study and looked at what's changed since 2018. And we looked at 10 of the companies that participated in the initial study. And what we found was that bullying and sexual harassment has actually declined in Myanmar workplaces. This is likely because those companies have put an emphasis on putting in place policies and procedures and training to ensure that respectful workplaces are enabled within their workforce. If you go to the next slide, what we'll see here is that despite that reduction, employees are observing an increase in disrespectful behaviours during the COVID pandemic. And I'm just going to point out one of these. You'll see that there's been quite a noticeable increase in sexual harassment or bullying by clients or customers. And I'm going to go through this in some detail because I think it's really relevant for those of you whose business has customer or client interaction. Next slide, please. So many of you are already familiar with the concept of workplace bullying and workplace sexual harassment. So workplace bullying is repeated and unreasonable behaviour directed toward a worker or a group of workers that creates a risk to health and safety. So this could include things like yelling, swearing, gossiping about others, teasing someone in the workplace. What we're finding during COVID is that this kind of behaviour is increasing. It might be increasing because there's things going on outside the workplace around the COVID pandemic, which is making bullying behaviour seem more acceptable. An example of this is if, for example, there are numerous COVID cases found in a particular township, that perhaps employees from that township are experiencing more bullying behaviour because it's seen that they're a risk. We also saw, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, that employees who are of a Chinese origin were targeted for bullying in the workplace. So we're seeing an increase in bullying. We're also seeing an increase in quid pro quo sexual harassment. That's sometimes referred to as this for that harassment or power harassment. This is where a more senior person in the organisation sexually harasses somebody at a more junior level in the organisation. We're seeing an increase in this because companies are, as a result of COVID and the economic downturn, are restructuring or downsizing, and this increases the risk of this kind of behaviour, where a manager might say to an employee, if you do this particular sexual favour to me, I will ensure that you get to keep your job or not be made redundant, or you will keep your wages, this kind of thing. And employees are unlikely to report this kind of harassment. So it's really important that you encourage your employees to report any incidents that they witness or hear about. Next slide, please. There's some things you can do here, and I'm just going to highlight some of them because I'm really mindful we're running out of time. But it's really important at this time that you remind your employees of existing policies and grievance mechanisms relating to bullying and sexual harassment you have in the workplace already, and you might even want to consider having some kind of refresher training. You also want to communicate with your employees that there's a heightened risk of this kind of behaviour, and that if they hear about it, they should report it immediately. On to the next slide, I'm just going to cover for you a little bit about what we spoke about earlier, and that is customer and client aggression. So this is when customers exhibit unacceptable or hostile behaviour toward employees. It might be a gesture, it might be threatening behaviour, it might be verbal abuse, physical violence, or damaging property. So companies are starting to put in place communications to their employees and customers that this behaviour is unacceptable. And I've put some examples of some signage there that I've seen around the place, which is from companies communicating to customers that this kind of behaviour is not to be tolerated. The other thing you can do is make sure you give guidelines to your employees and supervisors on what to do if they experience customer and client aggression. How do they handle it? How do they report it? Where can they go to for support? And lastly, onto the next slide, I just wanted to cover off for you around the issue of domestic violence. This is a very sensitive topic, and we're finding that it is increasing during this COVID-19 period. Whilst stress is not a cause of domestic violence, it can contribute to more severe episodes of violence. So it's something to really watch out for. And I encourage you to read this guide to learn a little bit more about it. But the number one piece of advice I can give you as leaders in your organisation is it's very important to provide your employees with information about how to get help if they are experiencing domestic violence. However, it's very important not to do it whilst they're in the home, because they may be living with their perpetrator and it might put them at further risk if you're contacting them about domestic violence when they're working from home. So I really encourage you to send through via email or something some general information about counselling services or referral services, but don't give them too much information at home. We have some information at the end of this presentation, which we can get Theory to share with you, that has some referral services for domestic violence. I'm going to skip through the next slide and go to the next section, which is on mental health. This is coming up as an increasing issue for employees during the COVID pandemic. Next slide. So what we're seeing is that pandemic is greatly impacting the mental health of employees. It's leading to anxiety, concerns about health and well-being and family members. And this is really increasing with the economic crisis on top. You'll see that in Sri Lanka, we did a study and found a lot of employees are affected by this. If we go to the next slide, you'll also see some of the impacts we're seeing in Myanmar. We mentioned earlier that the Business Coalition for Gender Equality had done a study, and what they found was the effects of mental health on women are higher than that on men. So the types of things that both men and women were reporting was that they were experiencing stress due to the pandemic, but also stress due to financial concerns, the stress of balancing work and family, but also being isolated at home. So there's various things companies can do about that. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see what some of them are. Some of them include providing remote access to support for your employees. So if they're working from home, you can give them access to phone services and other online services to provide them with psychosocial support. You can also provide them with information on referral services to help them with direct support. But you can also set up peer support for them. And I'm going to give you a bit of an example of this. On the next slide, we've got an example from the large insurance company, AXA. And AXA has put in place a really comprehensive package to support their employees' mental health and wellbeing, which includes an awareness campaign, resilience training for managers and senior executives, setting up employee resource groups, providing over the phone counselling services with a qualified psychologist. They've got an employee assistance program. They also look at how they can support employees by having regular communication with them as well. So we've now gone through the 5 key areas or recommendations for how you might support your employees during the pandemic. I just would urge you to consider that some of these are short term, some of them are medium term, and some are long term. If we go to the final slide, you'll see that there are some really key takeouts for each of these 5 recommendations. Firstly, in terms of retaining female employees, it's really important to consider alternatives to redundancies. And Ollie went through some of what those were. The second is around the digital gender divide. Make sure that when your employees are working remotely, they have the right tools and we support them with the digital training if they need it. The third one is around care responsibilities. It's really important to have flexible working arrangements in place that are formalised. The fourth one is a respectful workplace culture. Again, it's important to have formal policies in place for respectful workplaces, but also to consider the safety of your employees, even when they're working from home. And lastly, around mental health and wellbeing, it's really good if you can provide mental health referral support to your employees. I'm going to stop there. I'm really aware we've gone quite over time, and I'll hand back to you, Thierry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you also to Oliver and Anna for all the presentations so far. I'll jump straight in and invite Mupwin, who's the Group People Officer of City Holdings, and Mr. Brett Jones, who's the CEO of Wave Money, to join me here to look at, we've heard a lot of research and findings of what's happening to the workforce during this fairly stressful times of COVID. We also heard a lot of recommendations. What I'd love to hear from you as leaders in your organization is how you're actually finding the COVID period play out for your workforce, especially in the gender arena. And I'm also interested to hear, there are a number of very useful recommendations that were mentioned. How have you found those practical to implement, if you've implemented anything? And in particular, we have challenges, right, in all organizations to deliver some of these wonderful recommendations, but there are these practical barriers that we might find, especially in a Myanmar specific context. So would love to hear that as well. Should I start off with you, Mupwin, and then I'll invite Brett to give his opinion.
Sure. So before answering your question, Madhuri, I want to just lay the ground, introduce our company and the level of employee we have in our company that will make sense to the audience. So we are a private group company, but we are we are a family-owned private group company embarking on the transformation journey. So partly we still hold on to the traditional process, but at the same time we are looking forward and trying to restructure way of working. So you see that our practices and the benefit that come across because of that as well. We have under us, we have 35 companies. They are grouped under 6 business units and 12,000 employees. 70% of them are shop floor employees. So again, the reaching out to employees, the awareness, the education, the access to financial support, things like that have the biggest impact on that 70% of employees as well. However, in our senior leaders, we have 46% of our senior leaders are females. And in our whole group of companies, 50%, a bit over 50% are female. So we are pretty, quite balanced in that from top level to the bottom level as well. So touching on the board, 31% of our board members are also female. So again, a company led by Darwin is sort of like, quite difficult for me to come and share the best practice because we have a kind of a given foundation that's led by led by her. So it's kind of, it's not about us doing things purposefully. It's just becoming as like a normal practice things for us. So the COVID impact, to be perfectly honest, we don't see much impact of gender balance before COVID and after COVID. I did get a data run at the start of COVID, which is around February, and the now. The gender balance is very, very similar. Of course, the impact has significant impact on our employee, especially since majority of them are still working in the customer facing. So things like shop assistants, facing with panic buying, particularly the young assistants that have to deal with that, in the odd hour in the afternoon. Our logistic drivers have to go through across towns to be able to deliver the products by having to queue up to get tested and things like that. So, we have business challenges as well as individual employee going through the challenges as well. We, as a business, we try not to make any redundant as a principle. So what we do is we do quite a lot of relocation job, relocation on across business, relocation regional as well. Even, if there is another area of the geographical region that we don't need the staff, we will move them if they're willing to and provide them with the relocation support as well. We do quite a lot of reskilling, upskilling to our employees, and we launch a learning management system, particularly to enable our employee to go through that reskilling. However, across COVID period, like I said, we don't, because even then we don't see the balance differences. However, the one thing that we have lost track of is that before COVID, we were able to provide a part-time worker to mom, like housewife, to be able to come out of the home while the kids at school and to work a couple of hours a day. That has kind of, the traction has slowed down, and it's particularly because of risk-based and individual choice of that as well. So COVID period, we support employees with the launch of the technical tools. So we launched our the employee app at the peak of wave 1. That is just purely to enable our employee to get access to us directly, and then we can communicate to them directly as well. So they do attendance management, they do chatting with each other. They have a confidential feedback channel to us. So if in case there is any difficulties that they have, for instance, harassments and abuse and things like that, they can get directly to the CEO of that particular company straight away, that the CEO can see the comment in confidence. So those are the things that we have seen part of COVID, and these are, like the support that we provide so far. The way that we track is we have survey that we call it Net Promoter Score. So we purely count on how many promoters do we have across the business. We look at the particularly on the gender base as well, and I'm quite happy to report to you that it's also balanced between female and male.
Thank you, Mapwen. Brad, you run an organization that has not only a lot of female employees, but in particular, a lot of your agents are female. What have you seen in your organization, and if there are any particular changes, how are you dealing with those?
Sure. Thanks, Manthiri. So I think for Wave, it's been a very interesting time during COVID, and it was interesting watching the presentations, because one of the first things that we did is we made sure that we kept all of our employees employed. And we also made sure that we kept salaries where they could. And the only reason we would change that, we decided as a management team, was that if the revenue or the profit of the company impacted such that we needed to make some changes. And we've been very fortunate we haven't had to do that. And that's been really important to me and also the board, because I think we realized that at a time like this, a lot of people many people across the families are actually being affected. Family members are losing jobs and so on. So if you're taking money away from employees, or employees are losing their jobs, then there's obviously there's impact that actually is felt beyond the employee. It's felt across many families. And so I think one of the things I've been very pleased with is we've been able to continue that economic stimulus that comes from, being able to keep people fully employed and fully paid. In terms of our business, I'll look at it from a female employee perspective and then a female agent perspective. Our head office, we're about 52% female. And I would actually have to say, we've been work from home since March 23rd, except for a very brief period where we came back to the office before the second wave hit. I would actually have to say, and from reading some of the material before this event, one of the biggest problems in Myanmar when it comes to the gender gap is unconscious bias. And it's this view that males may have that a female can't do the job, the managerial level job, because she has to compete with family. And the role of a Myanmar woman being really, you know, the organizer and the pretty much the principal worker in the family home. Obviously, you know, some men obviously feel it doesn't reconcile with them being a senior leader in the organization. I think I would hope that COVID has actually proved one thing, and certainly work from home has proved that. There should be no unconscious bias about the ability for a woman to work from home and still actually deliver what she needs to deliver, because that's certainly what we've seen in WAVE during the period of work from home. You know, we've had all of our head office staff working from their homes, and there are challenges with that. You know, we know there are multi-generational homes. It can be difficult sometimes for the employees to negotiate with their mothers or grandmothers that they need to actually put focus on their work, not on cleaning the house or other domestic duties. But I would say in general, our female employees have been amazing with the way they've managed that balance. And if there is one thing that comes from COVID, I would hope that that unconscious bias of saying that a woman has to actually make a decision between home life and work life actually disappears through this. Because I think what the women in our company have certainly proven is that they can absolutely manage their family responsibilities and their work responsibilities and deliver great work and do it working from home. So I think that's certainly been an outcome we've seen. I mean, we've done a lot of things to support staff. For example, we recognised that a lot of the staff had unstable internet connections, so we introduced a broadband allowance and really encouraged all staff to get broadband connections. You know, we introduced the telemedicine approach, so our staff are able to use the telemedicine facilities of Panlang as their first port of call for medical, and a lot of the other things that have been talked about. The other element, of course, in our business is the agents, and we have 65,000 agents that serve the community and serve the country. One of the very good things that's actually happened during COVID is that they were deemed an essential service. And so they've had to keep their businesses open. And one of the amazing things of Myanmar, by comparison to other mobile money implementations around the world, is that 80% of our agents are female. And so what this has meant is that you've got the retail trade, the informal retail trade of the country has generally stayed open to provide those really essential money transfer services during the COVID period. And I've been thinking about this lately and really thinking what Myanmar would have looked like without those 80% of agents providing those services. When you think about it, the road network shut down, buses shut down, people were unable to move from township to township. People didn't want to go to banks because they were worried about COVID. So they've been using WAVE to transfer money. And I just imagine what Myanmar would have been like without businesses like WAVE and our competitors and really the ability to transfer money. So what we've, so since COVID started, we've actually given out about 62 billion chat in commissions to agents. And when you think about that, 80% of that is going to females. So that's a pretty significant economic stimulus that's going into the community as well. So I would say for us as a company, COVID has been an opportunity for us to really continue the digitization of Myanmar. I would say for us, our female workers have been inspirational in the way they've really accommodated the struggles of both family and home life, family and work life. But they've really delivered, and something I'm really proud of. And then from the agent side, once again, you know, they've sort of stepped up as well and made sure that the agents around the country have remained open, which has provided that really critical service to the Myanmar people.
Thank you for that, Brad. Another question that I wanted to ask both of you, and I'll again go with Mapwin first. Mapwin, you mentioned, you know, a third of your board are female, and we want to talk about the role of the board in issues such as this, being the Myanmar Institute of Directors, but also because we believe that all these governance matters or looking after key stakeholders, which are employees, is something that the board should be very heavily involved in. So during this period, has the requests that you're getting getting from the board change? Are you giving the board different kind of information when it comes to gender? I was a bit disturbed to hear that in some organizations, things like sexual harassment has gone up because the organization itself is stressed, and certain people are taking advantage of that. So it's really up to the line managers to make sure they're taking care of their people. What's that relationship between the board and your management, and how are you tackling this issue together?
So I think we started with setting up the structure framework, start from top. So it's not about responding to COVID per se. It's about how we go through this whole journey of being ethical and being the employer of choice and things like that. So as from day one, we have our 2025 vision, and we have our values, and our preferred way to be seen by our supplier, our customer, our employee. So in part of this, as we said, that we aspire to be to be the employer of choice. We said that we want to be the preferred business supplier as well. So those are the things that we, as in when I say we, is more the board and the leadership team has set up the direction of the company, and in driving it down, we have set up a leadership principle that particularly, one of the leadership principles that particularly says that we will be considerate of others' interests and their well-being. So that is embodied in the board, the senior leadership, the leadership throughout the organization. So that's how kind of we set ourselves up, and that's the role of the board is to lead by the example and to drive that agenda through the organization. So not particularly for COVID per se, but that is already, the platform is already there for us. It's a little bit easier for us to walk through the path, considering the needed employees during the COVID period.
So can I take it as your board is already looking at gender and ways to address gender equality? You mentioned that because it's founded by a woman, it's sort of almost natural within your culture. Do you have specific ways in which you're looking at gender?
So can I, just to be clear, that we do not address gender specific. I think, my personal view, it would be wrong to just address one particular diversity or one particular exposure to discrimination. We set ourselves for an ethical and an understanding and a more rounded organization from the culture point of view. So we said that we will be, as a leader, we will be considerate for others' interests and well-being. That can be anything. So gender is the first type of diversity that we would consider, that will come the biggest impact in when people look at the company. But again, gender is the biggest. We have half of our employees are female, and more than half of the talent in the market are female, and more than half of our consumers are female. So it's a given that we will be more obvious from that angle. But in general, it's more of an ethical viewpoint and being equal to everybody.
I think that's a great answer. Thank you, Mapwin. Brad, can I ask you sort of your view of the board's responsibility with regards to gender inclusion and maybe, as Mapwin said, equality in general?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the first things with my board, and unfortunately there are no female board members, which is something that needs to be addressed in time, in short time, hopefully. But I think they're certainly always very interested in the care and welfare of the employees. And we've been doing engagement surveys, and recently got our last engagement survey back, where we saw a significant increase in engagement during COVID, which I think was a reflection of the attention that we've put on the staff. I think my leadership team has certainly been very engaged around development and female development, and a big part of it is because we tend to find the talent a lot of the time comes from our female management and staff. And I don't want to sort of demonstrate a different bias, but I think certainly we see a lot of very talented females who see the opportunity in organisations like Wave Money, because it actually you know, we give the opportunity for them. You know, we don't have barriers. We don't have gender barriers. So you know, the best person will get the role. And so we try to encourage that type of environment and culture. You know, one of the things that we put in place, I'm a big believer in showing people role models. And you know, in the gender side, one of the things we've done is implemented a senior women from Myanmar in business in different parts of society to come and actually present to our female leaders. And I think, you know, Thierry, you're our first presenter, which was received very well. We've also been very lucky to have Dor Win come and present to our female leaders and staff. And I think for, you know, the feedback I've had when we've run those sessions has been that when they can speak very candidly and ask questions about anything, work-life balance, all these type of things, that they actually realize that there's nothing really stopping them, and that there are opportunities and there are role models that they can start to actually look to. And I would hope that, you know, in a country that has as its leader a female, that we have plenty of opportunities for females to actually look to those role models and develop over time.
I think that's a great thing to hear, and I'm really delighted to hear that your organization, all the females in your organization, are energized. I had the pleasure of speaking to them, and they are a wonderful group of ladies. So it was my pleasure to do that. Can I just maybe ask each of you just very simple question just to end our panel, given that the time is running away from us, and it's more of a positive question. You know, as we look forward to, you know, all of us emerging from this COVID crisis, how do you see the opportunities in your organizations, especially with regards to your workforce and inclusion and equality and indeed gender? Can we do the same sequence again? We'll have Mapwe and then Brett. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I think you know, once we've gone through this hurdle, I think we need to pace ourselves a little bit. So, you know, this whole COVID period has put in quite a lot of strain on us, you know, leaders and the team as well. So I think caring and rebuilding that team ethos would be the key thing. So we have been starting to do that with, you know, like teaching the leaders to do a self-care, and then, you know, like that being rolling out to the team and looking after each other, providing platforms to employees on you know, like the financial care, the healthcare, the mental care, things like that. So I think we need to emphasize more on that. We would probably be start looking at, or definitely be start looking at the preempting the future and how to get ourselves a little bit more agile. So we know that the COVID has put quite a lot of strain on us. You know, we have been showing, you know, the agility of organization in responding to that, but I think we should be using this lesson learned to prepare ourselves, you know, capability-wise, the culture-wise, and things like that.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I mean, we're an organisation that's going through significant growth. I mean, one of the things we've done during COVID, which I find quite amazing. So Martin Tar, who runs our HR team, we've gone from an organisation of about 200 people to an organisation of 280 during COVID. So we have 80 people who have never stepped foot in our office, but have been onboarded remotely. Well, that's a bit of a lie. They came to the office to get their laptop, but apart from that, they've never worked in the office. And we're going to grow to the end of next year, probably to about 450. So we have we're an organisation that gender is not a barrier. We're an organisation where we provide development opportunities, and I personally want to see the percentage of women in management far higher than it actually is today. So I would say that, you know, we're an organisation that is an attractive employer, and I think for the talented women of Myanmar, I'd encourage you to have a look at Wave Money.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Mapwe, for all your insights during this webinar. I'm going to invite next Ms. Kate Lazarus, who is the Senior Asia ESG Advisory Lead with the IFC. Kate was here in Myanmar until not so long ago. So Kate, great to see you again on screen at least, and hope all things are well. I'm handing the floor over to you to give us some closing remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry. And yeah, nice to see you as well, and everyone in Myanmar. I'm so pleased to have join this session. I mean, it was really, really good. All of the speakers were just really so interesting to listen to. So I was pretty captivated, during the whole session while I was trying to, put together some closing remarks for this. So I'd very much, like to thank the Myanmar Institute of Directors for hosting this important seminar and webinar on gender and COVID-19. I think that the bridging of the two aspects in terms of looking at, the role of the board and board diversity with the COVID-19 implications is just really crucial and very timely. And I think it's evident from the presentations and discussion that we had today that there's, a growing body of research and practice that's out there that really shows that importance of gender diversity on boards and also the references into senior leadership as well. So we heard about some of the links to improved financial performance and shareholder value. And I think we know at IFC that, of course, for the private sector, that's really, crucial to show and to make those linkages. And we heard about, for example, at least one woman on the board, and then even in the case of 30% on the board does lead to more increases on return on assets and return on equity. And that there's also linkages to increasing customer and employee satisfaction, greater investor confidence, and enhancing the market knowledge and reputation. So we also heard about the positive influence of companies' sustainability profile. But we also really heard about, the importance of hearing from female leaders. And I really love that, in terms of hearing from different people in different disciplines who can be role models. And this is really a great approach that I hope others can advance and draw on. We also heard that, this idea that, talent is not available, for women to be in leadership positions. This is just really not true, and that we should, as, private sector colleagues, make all efforts that we can to bring new talent into the workplace. And, Brad referred to this around unconscious bias, which is also really another area I'm really passionate about. And in IFC, we do a lot of training and discussions on unconscious bias and that notion that women can't do the job. They don't have the skills, or the skills are not out there, or that it competes with family responsibilities, really seems to have been debunked in several instances, and that employees are really working to try to, while still facing some of these stresses that we heard and challenges during this pandemic, that there are also a growing body of employees that are working to try to manage this. And I really hope that this unconscious bias disappears so that different companies can grow. And it's also interesting to hear about increases in employees and so forth. So I think the webinar was also crucial as it presented the 5 strategic gender priorities for companies in Myanmar during COVID. Based on research that previously had been done by IFC on childcare and respectful workplaces in Myanmar. I think that, this pandemic, we heard, is affecting everyone, but that the notion that, women and men are impacted differently by COVID is crucial for us to understand and break down. And we heard that women are more likely to be concerned about, their household finances and having enough to eat. And, the percentage of women having their hours reduced, during this period compared to men is also significant. Now, with the 5 practical strategies, it was very interesting to hear also from the examples from CityMart and from Wave about some of them that you've already employed, which is really great as well in terms of, for example, the importance of retaining staff and maintaining gender balance and looking at alternatives to layoffs. So Mapwin discussed about the work that CityMart is doing to employ approaches to relocating people, in other areas of the business or in other locations so that they don't have to make them redundant. And Brad spoke about, keeping as many employees, employed and keeping their salaries at the levels that they had before. I think this is crucial examples, as well as around the digital divide, which we heard this has accelerated during COVID-19, we heard about, you know, the importance of the launching of the employee app with CityMart and getting so that employees have direct access to management and getting information that they need. And of course, you know, the support that companies are providing for broadband or telemedicine examples, or of course, the role that, you know, the banking sector plays and the importance that people are not comfortable to go to the banks and so forth. So we also heard, of course, about, you know, the childcare demands, about respectful workplace cultures and mental health. And all in all, I think, you know, we've learned about that strong role that the board gender diversity can play, and the encouraging environment, you know, for women in leadership, and that raising awareness around this is crucial. And I think this webinar confirmed again that there's a lot of research out there. There's some good practices, and that we need to employ more practices of how to understand what this means for our companies as well. Just some of the keywords that, you know, really resonated for me, you know, that we as private sector and in organizations need to continue to think about and employ during these challenging times is around, you know, caring for our employees, caring for our colleagues, the rebuilding effort, you know, so how we can rebuild together, how we can draw on all of us as role models with different experiences, but all leading to, you know, positive outcomes, that notion of unconscious bias, and really trying to work in our inner selves to address being agile and flexible, and also being very self-aware. So I'd very much like to thank MIOD for their leadership in hosting the webinar, and to all the speakers, and of course to our donors, the governments of Australia and UK, and wishing everyone safe and well-being in Myanmar. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. And from the MIOD, thank you again to Kate, who's the Senior Asian ESG Advisory Lead, our panelists, Dr. Wim Kyu-han, Group Chief People Officer of City Holdings Limited, and Mr. Brett Jones, CEO of Wave Money, and of course, Mr. Anna Aliyev, who's the Corporate Governance Officer of the IFC. We had Ellen Maines, Operation Officer of the IFC, and Oliver Roundtree, Gender Associate at the IFC. And just a general also just big thank you to all of you at IFCs for supporting the MIOD, and of course our donors, the governments of the United Kingdom and Australia for supporting us directly, as well as supporting the IFC corporate governance program in Myanmar, which is tremendously helpful, I think, for private sector development and just helping our organizations grow. So thank you, a special thank you from us on that. And thank you to all of you for joining us. This is our last MIOD webinar of the year. It is the 22nd of December, but we will be back in January with renewed programming. And especially for those of you on the line who are MIOD members, we will be doing a MIOD a New Year gathering. It may have to be online. There are a lot of exciting new initiatives that we would like to share with you. So we hope to see you there. And until then, wishing everybody a fantastic holiday season and a very happy 2021. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.